Listen carefully, because there are stories history buries so deep that when they surface, they feel like a threat. In August of 1827, a man was found dead in his own library, his skull not fractured, not cracked, but compacted inward, as if human bone had been treated like wet clay. Physicians would later whisper that bone fragments were discovered embedded in a mahogany desk 6 feet away. Not shattered by a weapon, not struck by iron, crushed by hands. And then the suspect vanished. No footprints, no blood trail, just absence. Her name, according to surviving documents, was Sarah Drummond. She stood 6 feet 8 inches tall in a world where most men barely reached her shoulder. She weighed over 240 pounds of dense muscle, bone, and silent restraint. And in the official record, she was not listed as a person. She was listed as property. But before we talk about death, we need to talk about systems. Because what happened in that library was not a crime of passion. It was the final pressure release of an engineered horror. Charleston in the 1820s was not just a city. It was a machine. A well-oiled mechanism designed to convert suffering into wealth with ruthless efficiency. Ships arrived not carrying people but inventory. Human beings were priced, cataloged, advertised. Strength was currency. Endurance was profit. Silence was survival. The rice plantations surrounding the city were a special kind of hell. Men and women were forced to stand in swamp water for hours. Their skins split by insects, disease working its way into their blood. Death rates were so high that replacement was built into the business model. This wasn't negligence. It was calculus. And occasionally the market found a rarity. Sarah wasn't just purchased to work. She was purchased to be controlled, to be owned, to be mastered by a system that believed physical size meant spiritual submission, that no matter how large the body, the will could be broken. What the records do not show, what they never show, is the psychological architecture behind this. The daily rituals designed to erase identity. The language of ownership. The collars. The numbers. The deliberate reduction of a living being into a tool. Understand this now. Systems like this don't underestimate strength. They believe they can tame it. And for years, according to plantation logs, that belief seemed justified. Sarah did not scream. She did not resist. She worked. She watched. She endured. But silence is not weakness. Silence is storage. By the time Josiah Crane brought her to Marsh Bend Plantation, he believed he had made an exceptional investment. What he actually bought was pressure. And pressure, given enough time, always finds a way to move outward. Once you understand that, the sound of a skull collapsing in a quiet library no longer feels shocking. It feels inevitable. Marsh Bend Plantation ran on discipline masquerading as order. Every sunrise was a signal, not to begin work, but to surrender time. Bells rang not to guide, but to remind, your body is no longer yours. The overseer counted bodies like tools, eyes scanning for weakness, hesitation, any sign of individuality that could spread like infection. Sarah was immediately marked as a problem, not because she disobeyed, but because she didn't break. Most control systems rely on visible collapse. Tears, pleas, rage. Those responses reassure authority that power is working. Sarah offered none of them. She moved through the fields with the same silent precision she had shown on the auction block. When others faltered beneath the weight of swollen, waterlogged earth, she lifted twice her share without complaint. When punished collectively, she showed no reaction. No resentment, no fear. That unsettled them. Because what unsettles power most is not rebellion but unreadability. The overseer would later write that she did not look at the ground like the others. Her eyes didn't dart when approached. She watched, measured, as if she were studying patterns instead of suffering. This violated the unspoken rule of mastery. The enslaved must internalize inferiority. They must believe the lie, and Sarah didn't. The system escalated. Extra labor, heavier loads, isolation, attempts to humiliate her, physically forcing her to wear restraints built for men. Collars tightened to remind her mass did not equal autonomy. And still, she absorbed it all without visible reaction. Understand what was happening here. When institutional control fails to fracture the mind, it moves toward domination of the body. Not to discipline but to prove hierarchy. To reassure the master that he still sits atop the pyramid. This is how cruelty rationalizes itself. At night, Sarah returned to her cabin and said little. Others spoke later of her sitting awake long after dark, hands resting on her knees, breathing slow, eyes open. No prayer, no crying, just stillness. The kind of stillness that doesn't come from submission but from calibration. Because while systems teach victims to forget who they are, they also teach something else inadvertently: pattern recognition, cause and effect, the true mechanics of power. Sarah learned how orders traveled, who gave them, who benefited. She observed when punishment intensified and when it eased. She learned Crane's habits: how he drank, how he liked silence at night, how he retreated into his library to feel untouchable. Libraries, after all, are where men like Crane go to reassure themselves that they are civilized. But here is the truth buried beneath plantation mythology. Ownership creates a fantasy of safety. Masters believe walls, distance, and authority separate them from consequences. They forget that every system relies on human containment, and containment always has a breaking point. Sarah did not imagine escape as flight. She imagined it as inversion. Not running from the system but folding it inward on itself. Power doesn't fear anger. It fears precision. And somewhere between the swamps and that quiet library, Sarah stopped being a worker inside the machine and became an inevitability moving toward its source. By the summer of 1825, the atmosphere at Marsh Bend had shifted. The air itself seemed to carry tension, the kind you can feel pressing on your chest without ever seeing the source. Plantation workers whispered about her in the fields, how she moved like a storm barely contained, how her hands were so large they could envelop a man's head. But the talking was dangerous. The master's ears were always listening. Fear was currency, and Sarah, unseen by authority, was quietly amassing it in a way no one could measure. Crane, confident in his ownership, began to test the limits of her compliance. He brought her into the main house under the pretense of reward, but his methods were always control disguised as attention. He tried to provoke her, to remind her of her place, ordering her to lift weights too heavy for normal men, standing too close in hallways to remind her of the power dynamic. Observers later noted that she did not flinch, did not resist. Her face remained blank, her gaze distant but calculating. And yet, beneath that stillness, something was accumulating. Trauma, observation, understanding. She learned the mechanics of fear and command, how a raised voice could fracture others, how subtle gestures could intimidate, how silence could manipulate entire rooms. She became a master of human behavior without anyone realizing it. The plantation had trained her in the language of power, just in the wrong way. There were stories that circulated in hushed tones, incidents in the fields that made overseers pause. Horses bolted when she approached. Tools bent inexplicably under her grip. Objects moved without apparent effort. Some claimed she could stop a man mid-sentence with a look, and the rumor of her strength grew until it became something almost mythic. The plantation tried to frame these tales as exaggerations, yet the unease they generated was real. Then came the nights. Sarah would walk the boundaries of the plantation, moving silently along the levees, staring at the water and the shadowed forests beyond. Some said she muttered under her breath in a language no one recognized. Others swore they felt her presence even when she was alone. Her mind, honed by years of surveillance, began plotting not flight, but reclamation. She understood that physical strength alone could intimidate, but psychological mastery could dismantle her oppressors entirely. Every system has blind spots. Every tyrant believes walls and distance protect them from consequence. Sarah studied every blind spot, every habit, every moment of unguarded confidence in Crane's routine. And as the plantation's cruelty escalated, she fed it back into her planning, transforming fear into a kind of fuel. By this point, she was no longer just a slave. She was a convergence of suppressed rage, engineered endurance, and raw physicality, quietly preparing to do something history would not forget. When she finally acted, it would not be random. It would be a lesson precise, inevitable, and irreversible. Would you comment below twice, "I see the invisible," if you are following this story and ready to step into its truths? This is not just a ritual. It's the lock and key to understanding what comes next. The night of August 14th, 1827, began like any other at Marsh Bend. The air was thick with the scent of rice paddies, wet earth, and the faint tang of the Ashley River. Crane had retired early to his library, confident in his supremacy, surrounded by walls, books, and the illusion of safety. The house was silent except for the occasional crackle of the fireplace, a sound he mistook for control. Sarah had been inside the fields and cabins all day, but she didn't move with the fatigue of labor. She moved with the calculation of someone who had spent years turning observation into strategy. Her massive frame, which had once been a spectacle for the auction, was now an instrument silent, precise, and terrifying. She understood the patterns of Marsh Bend better than anyone, when the guards slept lightly, which doors creaked under minimal weight, and how the softest steps could mask the approach of a force unseen. Control relies on predictability, and Sarah had studied Crane like a scholar studying an experiment. Every habitual gesture, every subtle arrogance he carried, she memorized it. The library, a place he considered sanctuary, was not just a room but the stage for his undoing. A skull is hard to break. A human skull is harder. But the human body, engineered for subjugation, becomes vulnerable when confronted with true strength and intent. According to reports, witnesses never saw her approach. No one opened the door, no one announced her arrival. One moment, Crane was alone, secure. The next, the sound of impact, metal hitting bone, muffled yet resonant through mahogany walls. The force described by the coroner was beyond natural human capacity. Yet it was delivered by flesh, muscle, and an unrelenting will. It was justice shaped like hands. The accounts are clinical, almost too precise for a legend. Bone fragments embedded in the desk. The body displaced, crushed inward. The room a silent theater of inevitability. And then, she disappeared. No tracks in the dirt. No whispers of her path into the August night. She became a ghost of power, leaving behind only the undeniable evidence of what happens when oppression meets concentrated, disciplined force. Think carefully here. What this story teaches is not just about strength, it's about timing, awareness, and the accumulation of pressure. Oppression isn't broken by rage alone. It is broken by strategy, by a mind that has seen every angle, calculated every risk, and waited for the exact moment when the system's arrogance reaches critical mass. Power built on fear assumes it is untouchable. It is not. This act was more than vengeance. It was revelation. It exposed the fragility of a machine built on human suffering. The master, untouchable in his mind, was mortal in reality. And history records only fragments, the official documents, the whispers, the disbelief. But the truth lingers. Systems crumble from within when someone knows exactly how to wield what they have been given without permission, without warning, and without hesitation. Now, comment again twice, "I see the invisible," if you feel the weight of what just unfolded. Step into the understanding that is not merely historical, but deeply instructive. After that night, Marsh Bend Plantation became a paradox. The land, still fertile and swollen with tidal rivers, seemed untouched, yet the fear it harbored was tangible. Workers reported an unease that couldn't be traced to sound or sight, as if the very air had shifted. Authority no longer felt like an external structure, it had been violated at its core. The coroner's reports, preserved in Charleston archives, only hint at what the community refused to name aloud. Sarah Drummond had become a legend before anyone fully understood her. The mechanics of fear had changed. Power no longer flowed strictly from wealth, position, or violence, it now carried vulnerability. The once calculated rituals of dominance, overseers pacing fields, chains clinking against wrists, bells marking labor, felt fragile. Everyone understood, though no one could speak it. The boundary between control and chaos was thinner than they had ever imagined. Sarah's disappearance into the night was as deliberate as her act itself. She left no trace, but she left a psychological imprint that would outlive her physical presence. That imprint is the essence of forbidden knowledge. The realization that the structures around you, the systems that claim to protect, to govern, to enforce, are only as strong as the perception of compliance. When compliance is stripped away, the system's weakness becomes self-evident. Consider this in modern terms. We think of control as overt: laws, contracts, institutions. Yet the principle is identical. Power survives on predictable reactions. It fails when the observed no longer reacts predictably, when the human element, rage, intellect, observation becomes an instrument of disruption. Sarah Drummond weaponized what was denied to her. Not just brute strength, but awareness, timing, and the deep study of those who thought themselves untouchable. And here is the deeper, more dangerous lesson. Her story isn't just historical. It's psychological. Every system, every hierarchy, every institution you encounter, corporate, political, social, relies on similar blind spots. Blind spots are where leverage accumulates, where small acts calculated over time can topple entities that appear immovable. Historians argue endlessly whether Sarah was real or legend. But legends, especially ones born of fear and suppression, often contain a kernel of systemic truth far more disturbing than the details themselves. What she demonstrated was an undeniable principle. Mastery over oneself and one's observations can overturn structures far larger than a single individual. This is why forbidden knowledge terrifies those who claim power. It proves that obedience is not inevitable, that control is a fragile artifice, and that a single, disciplined mind can invert a centuries-old hierarchy with precision. If you've been following closely, you understand the gravity. You understand that this story is not just a tale of a giant woman, it's a lesson encoded in history for those willing to perceive the invisible threads of power around them. What's most chilling about Sarah Drummond isn't just her size or strength, it's how she embodies the principle of inevitability. Think about it. Crane, a man of wealth and influence, believed he controlled her because he controlled the environment. He had wealth, status, and the laws of society on his side. Yet all of those measures of authority dissolved the moment she decided to act. This is a recurring pattern in the hidden architecture of power. Systems are fragile not because they are poorly built, but because they rely on assumptions about human behavior. Sarah's story forces us to confront a deeper truth. Oppression can be meticulously engineered, but it cannot account for the emergence of uncontainable awareness. The plantation had taught her how to endure. It had taught her how to observe. It had taught her the rules. But it could not teach her obedience in the presence of injustice. That line between endurance and rebellion is where transformation occurs. And that transformation is dangerous for any system that depends on submission. We have to understand the psychological mechanics at play. The longer someone is held in a system that measures every action, every thought, every gesture, the more they understand the cracks. The more subtle the observation, the more precise the eventual response. Sarah's act of crushing Crane's skull was not impulsive. It was the product of years of calculated attention, a quiet accumulation of knowledge, body, and mind aligned to one purpose. Consider how many layers of control existed around her. Social hierarchies, institutional norms, daily rituals of submission, physical chains, mental coercion. And yet she converted all of it into a map, a blueprint for the collapse of the very system meant to enslave her. That is the kind of power that scares the people who wield authority. Not the unpredictable, but the precisely inevitable. And this is where the story becomes symbolic for anyone seeking understanding of hidden forces. Every system, governmental, corporate, familial, cultural, depends on repetition, obedience, and predictability. Disrupt the pattern, and the illusion of safety unravels. Disrupt it with precision, and the outcome is catastrophic for those who believed control was absolute. Sarah's disappearance afterward was intentional. She didn't flee because she had nowhere to go. She disappeared because the story was now bigger than any location, bigger than any person. She became a living lesson in the anatomy of power, a ghost who taught what laws, wealth, and tradition could not. At this point, if you haven't already, comment twice, "I see the invisible," to mark your awareness. Recognize that knowledge of these patterns isn't passive, it transforms perception. Once you see the mechanisms behind control, nothing appears the same again. The legend of Sarah Drummond, however, did not end with her act of vengeance. It echoes through history as a warning. Systems built on oppression are inherently unstable. Even when no one witnesses the full extent of her power, the psychological reverberations spread like ripples in water. Plantation records describe unease among workers and masters alike, a fear that could not be named, a shadow that no authority could illuminate. What makes her story so potent is the way it exposes the anatomy of domination. Every rule, every hierarchy, every chain, every whip, each was designed to fracture the mind, enforce submission, and standardize behavior. Yet these instruments, when observed with clarity, reveal their own vulnerabilities. Sarah understood this. She internalized the architecture of control and transformed it into a weapon. This is a principle hidden in plain sight in every system. Authority always underestimates the observant. Her act, seemingly supernatural in its execution, is actually a precise example of what happens when a disciplined mind and body collide with institutional overconfidence. It illustrates the inevitable collapse that occurs when enforcement relies on fear without comprehension, when compliance is assumed rather than earned. Sarah's library became a crucible where centuries of imposed hierarchy were obliterated in an instant, proof that even the most rigid systems can be undone by a single actor who understands them better than anyone else. Notice how this story parallels modern power structures. Wealth, position, or legal authority cannot insulate against knowledge, strategy, and timing. Systems, no matter how grand or intimidating, depend on obedience, and obedience is only as reliable as the human element allows. Sarah's story teaches that mastery of perception and patience can invert a hierarchy in ways those at the top cannot anticipate. It's a blueprint of subversion disguised as legend. This is the dark truth that authorities hope you never internalize. All control is conditional, all hierarchies are permeable, and all power, physical, institutional, or psychological, has a breaking point. Those who study systems, who observe without fear, who endure without surrender, can turn the tools of oppression into instruments of transformation. Sarah Drummond, in her silence and her strength, embodies that principle. Her name may be whispered, contested, or dismissed in history books, but the lesson remains. Knowledge, patience, and precision can topple the seemingly untouchable. She is both myth and manual, a warning and a guide for those willing to see beyond the surface of power. Once more, commit to understanding. Comment twice, I see the invisible. Let this mark your recognition that the world is structured, controlled, and manipulable, but also that the observant can alter its course forever. What remains after the echoes of Sarah Drummond are not the fragments of a skull or the whispers of witnesses, but the enduring principle. Control is a veneer, a fragile illusion built on predictable behavior, fear, and the suppression of awareness. Crane's death was only the most dramatic expression of a truth that stretches far beyond a single plantation or a single century. It is the anatomy of authority exposed for all who choose to see. Imagine, for a moment, the systems that surround you today. Governments, corporations, institutions, social hierarchies, all of them rely on compliance, on the assumption that people will move as expected, think as expected, behave as expected. Sarah's story illuminates a terrifying possibility, that even the most fortified structure, the most confident authority, can be undone when one understands its patterns and bides time with precision. Strength alone is not enough. Knowledge alone is not enough. Alignment of mind, body, and timing, this is what turns inevitability into reality. History hides these lessons because they are dangerous. To internalize them is to change how you perceive the world, to awaken to the mechanisms behind obedience and hierarchy. Those in power hope you remain blind, that you never study the subtle motions that maintain control, that you never realize how fragile the towers of authority truly are. But once you see, once you understand, nothing looks the same again. Sarah Drummond's existence, whether she is remembered as fact or myth, teaches that the human spirit, when disciplined, observant, and patient, is capable of overturning the very forces designed to contain it. Her life was a calculus of suppression turned inward on the system itself, a demonstration of inevitability, a lesson that resonates with anyone willing to study the dynamics of power. And there is another truth, darker still. The more elaborate the system, the more elaborate the methods of control, the more spectacular the collapse when the right force, in the right mind, strikes at the right moment. Systems are fragile, authorities are vulnerable, and the unaware are bound by chains they do not see. Sarah's act is an allegory for all who would dare to study, endure, and then act with precision. So now, carry this knowledge with intent. See the invisible forces shaping every hierarchy around you. Understand their patterns. Learn their rhythms. Because the story of a giant slave woman crushing her master's skull is more than legend, it is a guide. And when the time comes, for those who are prepared, the impossible becomes inevitable. Power is never absolute. Only the observant can make it real. Only the patient, the disciplined, and the awake can survive it and transform it. Comment twice, I see the invisible, if you're ready to witness the truths history tried to bury. Subscribe and hit the bell because once you see the hidden mechanics of power, nothing will ever feel the same.